Imagine stepping toward a truth so deeply submerged that even allowing your thoughts to brush against it feels like trespassing on centuries of enforced silence. A truth sunk beneath stagnant swamp water, sealed by secrecy, and guarded by the unshakable arrogance of men who believed that if they burned the records, they could burn the reality that produced them. Tonight, on Chronicles of the Unusual, we cross a threshold that was never meant to be crossed. A doorway bolted not by metal or wood, but by generations of fear, shame, and the desperate belief that time itself would bury what human memory refused to forget. Before we continue, take a breath, because what you're about to hear survived only in fragments. Burned letters that never fully turned to ash, archives smudged by hands that tried to silence them, and whispered recollections passed down like contraband scripture. All of it pointing toward a scandal the Vatican hoped would vanish beneath the weight of divine authority. This is not folklore, not superstition carved into ghost stories. This is a narrative stitched together from surviving scraps that reveal 12 nuns living behind convent walls in rural Louisiana, a single enslaved man silenced by force and circumstance, and 12 children whose very existence threatened to crack open the Church's most carefully maintained illusion of purity. This is a chapter the Church hoped would dissolve into mud and memory, a moment when vows shattered under pressure, when the thirst for control bent truth into something unrecognizable, and when the fear of humiliation was treated as more holy than any life involved. And here, on Sanctum of the Hollow, we bring this truth into the light, because history doesn't disappear just because someone commands the shovels to stop digging. Truth seeps, it clings, it waits, which brings us to the first surviving whisper of this hidden past. Somewhere along the moss-draped swamps of Louisiana, there lies a sealed archive the Church has never publicly acknowledged. Before we descend into that forbidden record, I want to speak directly to you, the listener who stayed. Stories like this do not endure unless someone chooses to hold them. And if you're here, it means you are one of the rare few who do not flinch at the uncomfortable corners of history. If you're watching from Louisiana, from the deep south, or from any place where old buildings whisper secrets through their wood and stone, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know which shadows this story reaches toward, and what ground you stand on today. Because sometimes the truth buried beneath your own soil is closer than you think. This channel survives because of listeners like you, people who seek the truths others would rather torch, people who understand that history is not made of tidy dates and polished names, but of wounds, echoes, and hushed confessions that refuse to die. So before we move deeper, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear has never been told in full. Not in classrooms, not in churches, not in any official record the public was ever meant to see. To understand how this scandal began, you must picture the world that existed around it. A world where St. Landry Parish appeared peaceful on the surface, yet pulsed with tension underneath. A place where generosity and piety were displayed proudly, while darker truths hid beneath polished floorboards and behind stained glass windows. South of Opelousas sat St. Martinville, a fragile pearl of old French culture resting in the suffocating heat of Louisiana's marshlands, where the Bayou Teche wound lazily past sugar fields and dense cypress groves that swallowed the sun long before dusk. Humidity curled around every house, every porch, every pew, yet the town clung to a cultivated elegance inherited from French aristocrats who fled revolution and rebuilt their sense of refinement on the backs of enslaved laborers. In this place, cultures tangled into a strange and restless blend: French, Spanish, English, Creole, and at night, the sound of distant voodoo drums rose from enslaved quarters, while the Catholic bells answered at dawn, each claiming a piece of the souls who lived there. 3 miles north of the town, concealed behind a narrow road that turned into thick mud whenever the rains arrived, stood the convent of the Sacred Mercy, a structure the community admired for its charity and devotion, never imagining the storm of secrecy and guilt building silently within its walls. The convent itself was erected in 1838 by Madame Céleste Dufossat, a wealthy widow whose fortune in sugar had grown so immense she believed extravagant piety could purchase her entry into heaven. She spared no expense in creating what she imagined to be a sanctuary of holiness. The building stood elevated on sturdy brick piers to survive seasonal floods, designed in the old West Indies style with wide galleries that circled both floors. catching whatever stray breeze dared cut through the Louisiana heat. Tall French windows stretched from floor to ceiling. Plaster walls shimmered in soft shades of yellow inspired by Provence, and the chapel glowed each morning with stained glass imported from Lyon, its colored light attempting to sanctify a place where sin was already quietly gathering strength. Surrounding the convent were 12 acres of meticulously maintained gardens, vegetable plots, laundry sheds, and storage cottages. A small cemetery sat at the far edge of the grounds, enclosed by a rusting iron fence, its stones marking forgotten tragedies and stillborn planter infants whose names had long dissolved into moss. Beyond that, hidden behind a curtain of Spanish moss and towering live oaks, stood the cramped quarters meant for the enslaved people who kept the convent functioning, unseen, unacknowledged, yet essential. By 1845, the convent housed exactly 12 sisters, all under the age of 35, all from respectable Creole or French families, each having taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience with sincere hearts and sheltered expectations. Their days were shaped by the rhythm of canonical hours, matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, vespers as the day dimmed, and compline as night settled over their world. They taught planters' daughters to read, stitched altar cloths with delicate hands, tended herb gardens, and lived a life of serene repetition that looked holy from the outside but gradually chipped away at their connection to the outside world and to their own unspoken desires. It was a quiet, isolated existence, one that left them vulnerable to longing they could not name and impulses they believed prayer alone could restrain. Among the enslaved workers were Hala, the elderly cook whose tired hands fed the entire community, her daughter Margot, who handled the laundry, and then came the man who would unknowingly become the axis upon which their entire world would tilt, Matthias, purchased specifically for the convent in March of 1845. He was 22, tall, strong, and of unusually light complexion, the product of generations of coerced unions that left him trapped between worlds, too light for the fields, too threatening for the house, and too intelligent for the comfort of those who claimed ownership of him. The bill of sale described him clinically as a likely Negro man, sound of limb, skilled in carpentry, docile of temperament. But the paper left out the truths that mattered, that he could read, a forbidden gift taught by an overseer's daughter, that he lost his mother at 7, that he watched his father beaten to death, that the scars across his back were earned at 15 for trying to visit his sister on a neighboring plantation. At the convent, he lived like a shadow, sleeping in a small room off the tool shed, eating alone, speaking only when spoken to, valued only for his labor. To the sisters, he was not a man, but an invisible presence who performed miracles of work without ever demanding acknowledgement. And yet, it was here, in this fragile ecosystem of rigid vows, isolated women, suffocating heat, and a man stripped of choices, that the first barely visible cracks began to form. Cracks that would soon split their world apart. The first unmistakable sign that something had gone terribly wrong inside Sacred Mercy did not come from the sisters themselves, but from the sharp eyes of Monsieur Laurent Guidry, the plantation owner whose land bordered the convent's eastern fence. A man so meticulous he drank his morning coffee at precisely 6 o'clock every day, surveying his world as if it were a ledger that needed constant balancing. Guidry noticed in late April of 1846 that Sister Marie-Thérèse, the young woman who tended the herb garden, appeared fuller around the waist. Her habit curved differently, subtly, in a way that did not align with the harmless softness gained from convent meals. He tried to dismiss the sight, but by June he observed 3 other sisters carrying the same quiet swelling, an impossible pattern in a place sworn to chastity. When he cautiously mentioned this over supper to his wife, Delaine, she froze as though he had uttered profanity at the table, insisting he must be mistaken, that such a suggestion bordered on sacrilege. But Guidry knew what he had seen, and the seed of suspicion took root, even as he tried to force himself into silence. A week later, during confession, he hesitantly shared his concerns with Father Dominic Roussel, an elderly priest whose half-deaf ears had mastered the art of interpreting uncomfortable truths as harmless misunderstandings. The priest reassured him with practiced denial, blaming climate, diet, and delicate constitutions, but nature was about to expose what faith and fear had tried to hide. By October of 1846, truth ripped through the night with a sound that no amount of prayer could muffle. Sister Genevieve's screams echoed across the convent gardens as she went into sudden, unexpected labor, her cries shattering the silence like glass. Hala, the elderly enslaved midwife, was summoned at once, rushing up the narrow staircase to a room where Genevieve writhed in agony, while 5 other sisters hovered, each visibly pregnant, each carrying a secret no habit could disguise. The child arrived just after midnight, a baby girl with mixed features impossible to deny. Her skin pale, her cheekbones unmistakably shaped by the man the convent had tried so hard to render invisible. 3 days later, another sister gave birth. By Christmas, 6 infants, 4 girls and 2 boys, had been born behind those walls. No doctor was called, no priest was summoned for baptism, no parish records were filed. The children arrived like ghosts forced into flesh, wrapped in pieces of old altar cloth, tended by trembling hands that had never expected to cradle life. The convent's holy rhythm dissolved. Matins and vespers were overwhelmed by infant cries. Order became chaos, and through it all Matthias worked in silence, repairing fences, chopping wood, tending gardens, his expression empty, revealing nothing of the storm he had been forced into. The fragile sanctity of sacred mercy began to crumble, strained by guilt, fear, and a secret too vast for any wall, any prayer, any vow to contain. The true unraveling had begun. When swollen habits and midnight screams could no longer be dismissed as imagination, Mother Superior Turs finally understood that silence would not save them. What she did next marked the beginning of the Church's most calculated and darkest response. On a cold January morning in 1847, she summoned Matthias to her office for the first time since his arrival 2 years earlier. He stood at the doorway like a carved shadow, cap in hand, eyes fixed on a point just above her shoulder, as though direct eye contact might itself be a form of blasphemy. Her voice shook, not from pity, but from the terror of approaching disgrace, as she told him he was both the instrument of their ruin and the witness who must never be permitted to speak. The Church, she said, could not learn of this. The diocese could not learn of this. And if word reached New Orleans, sacred mercy would be shut down, the sisters defrocked, and the Church's moral authority fractured beyond repair. Matthias listened in silence as she explained the twisted logic she believed would protect them. He could not remain in their sight, yet he could not be sold, because a buyer might ask questions. So she sentenced him to a ghost's existence, exiling him to an old groundskeeper's cabin deep within the cypress grove, ordered to work only at night or at dawn when the sisters were locked in prayer. Meanwhile, the infants, the living proof of every broken vow, became a new crisis altogether. The Church could hide sins, but it could not justify harming baptized souls. Over the next 18 months, as more sisters delivered their children, Mother Superior built a web of secret placements stretching across Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. Each baby was sent to a distant family with polished lies about their origin. Some families were told the children were orphans from France. Others were assured they were the illegitimate offspring of wealthy Creole planters whose reputations demanded protection. Each lie was accompanied by an envelope of money marked as a donation, ensuring the infants would be raised in Catholic homes where no one would question their arrival. By August of 1848, all 12 children had vanished into new lives, absorbed into households unaware they were participating in one of the most meticulously engineered cover-ups in American religious history. On the surface, the convent returned to normal rhythm, prayers recited, hymns sung, chores completed. But beneath their habits, the sisters unraveled. One suffered blinding headaches, another starved herself into illness, another clawed her arms raw in sleepless torment. The vow of silence that once symbolized devotion became a suffocating cage none of them could escape. And through it all, Matthias lived alone in the swamp cabin, repairing fences no one saw him fix, chopping wood by moonlight, wondering whether he had been cursed, condemned, or simply discarded by a world that never considered him fully human. It was a fragile ecosystem collapsing under the weight of a truth too heavy to contain. As the walls of sacred mercy strained under secrets too heavy for any mortal to bear, one sister reached her breaking point, not through hysteria, but through a chilling clarity forged by sleepless nights and a conscience finally refusing silence. Sister Jean-Baptiste, the last to conceive and the most tormented, began writing an account late at night in her narrow cell, her candle trembling as though afraid to witness the truth she carved onto the page. She wrote in Latin, the language of Rome, the language of authority, because she intended her confession for the highest seat of the church, not the local diocese that had already failed them. Her testimony was precise and unflinching. She recorded how Sister Marie-Thérèse had been the first to cross the line, how private confessions between the nuns had transformed into dangerous approval, how one broken vow made the next seem less unthinkable. She described Matthias not as a seducer, but as a man trapped without choice, whose refusal would have cost him his life. With trembling hands, she sealed the letter and entrusted it to a visiting priest from New Orleans, believing, hoping, it would reach Rome and force accountability. But Father Almohaber read it in secret and delivered it instead to the Archbishop of New Orleans, a man more versed in political maneuvering than spiritual justice. And the moment he laid eyes on the letter, the church's quiet machinery began to turn. The Archbishop arrived at Sacred Mercy on October 20th, 1850, accompanied by two priests, one a Jesuit known for discretion sharpened by canon law. The chapter house became a courtroom cloaked in incense and dread. Standing rigid, hands clasped behind his back, the Archbishop listened as Mother Superior Thérèse, her face aged by guilt, confirmed that every word of the letter was true. One by one, the 12 sisters confessed, their voices trembling as the Archbishop measured their sins not against morality, but against the potential damage to the Church's reputation. In a region dominated by Protestant suspicion, a scandal involving pregnant nuns and an enslaved man would ignite a firestorm capable of destroying the Church's fragile foothold. His verdict was swift and merciless. The convent would be closed, its sisters dispersed across the nation to separate communities, each forced to take a new name and a perpetual vow of silence, forbidden to speak of sacred mercy even at the hour of death. Then came Matthias. The Archbishop's gaze hardened as he declared that Matthias could not be freed, for free men could talk and could not be sold, for a buyer might uncover the truth. His chilling solution: Matthias would simply vanish, swallowed by the swamp, as so many enslaved men had been before him, erased in the name of protecting the Church's immaculate facade. That decree struck Sister Jean-Baptiste like a blade, and it was in that moment she realized her letter had not saved anyone. It had placed Matthias in mortal danger, and she refused to become a silent accomplice to murder. For 3 nights after the Archbishop's decree, Sister Jean-Baptiste lay awake in her narrow cell, staring at the ceiling as her candle burned low, her mind racing with a single truth: Matthias would die unless she intervened. Guilt, once a quiet ache, sharpened into an unbreakable resolve. She realized that the Church, the institution she had trusted since childhood, would not hesitate to sacrifice one enslaved man to protect its image. And so she began crafting a second confession, not a plea this time, but a weapon. 17 pages of tightly written testimony naming every sister involved, every date of conception, every birth, every covert payment to adoptive families, and every priest who assisted in fabricating lies. She wrote with a precision born of fury. Then she made 4 identical copies. One she hid inside the lining of her prayer book. Another she entrusted to Hala, the elderly midwife, instructing her with fierce clarity to guard it, even if she could not read a single word. A third she mailed to her cousin in Mobile, whose husband was connected to abolitionist journalists eager to expose Catholic hypocrisy. And the fourth she handed directly to Mother Superior Tours during a secret meeting after Compline, placing the pages in her trembling hands and delivering a warning that struck like thunder. If Matthias vanished, through accident, sale, disease, or swamp, these documents would be released to the world. Protestant newspapers, she said, would devour the scandal and fire it back at the Church like artillery. Mother Superior nearly collapsed under the weight of the ultimatum, murmuring that the Archbishop would never bend to threats. But Jean-Baptiste met her gaze without flinching. "This is not a threat," she said. "It is what will keep the Church from becoming a murderer." The Archbishop reacted with fury when he learned of the copies. He threatened excommunication, confinement in an asylum, even the destruction of Jean-Baptiste's family reputation across Louisiana. But for the first time in his long career, he faced a scandal too entangled to suppress by force. In a nation already cracked by tension, Protestant suspicion, Catholic insecurity, slavery's moral rot, the disappearance of an enslaved man connected to 12 pregnant nuns would not be a scandal. It would be a wildfire. For days he met with advisors behind closed doors, weighing political ruin against institutional survival. Finally, he conceded to a compromise he detested. Matthias would be freed, legally, officially, undeniably. He would receive manumission papers, funds for travel, and letters of introduction to Northern Catholic communities, ensuring he could leave Louisiana without obstruction. In return, Jean-Baptiste would surrender 3 of the 4 confessions, keeping only the version in mobile as insurance. She agreed on one additional condition. She would speak to Matthias herself to make certain he understood the freedom he was being offered was real, not another trap disguised as mercy. Reluctantly, the Archbishop allowed it. That night, in the dim chapel lit by a single sanctuary lamp, Matthias entered wearing clean clothes for the first time in years. Jean-Baptiste explained everything: her letter, the scandal, the threat that saved his life. She wanted nothing from him but for him to live. And as she spoke, Matthias realized this was the closest thing to justice he would ever receive, not born from mercy, but from the courage of a woman who refused to let him vanish into the swamp without a fight. When Matthias walked out of the chapel carrying his freedom papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth, the machinery of the church's cover-up shifted into its final and most ruthless phase. At dawn on November 8, 1850, he stepped onto the Shell Road for the last time, the swamp mist curling around his figure like a ghost reluctant to release him. He carried nothing but a small canvas bag, $50 in coins, and the letters of introduction that would allow him to exist, legally, safely, for the first time in his life. He boarded a steamboat toward New Orleans under a new name, Matthias Duval, a quiet act of rebellion, a name that would later appear in distant census records bearing his handwriting. As the steamboat's whistle faded into the morning fog, the 12 sisters were uprooted from the only life they had ever known. Each woman was sent to a different convent across the South or as far north as Maryland, forbidden to write, forbidden to speak, forbidden to even remember aloud the lives they had once shared. Their identities were dissolved, replaced by new names and vows designed to erase sacred mercy from existence. Mother Superior Turs, crushed under the weight of secrets she once thought she could bury, spent her final years in a Carmelite monastery, whispering, "Forgive us," on her deathbed, words that meant nothing to the attendant who heard them, unaware of the ruin tied to each syllable. Sister Marie-Thérèse died in Baltimore, still teaching young girls with a quiet smile that never reached her eyes, and Sister Angelique, exiled to a harsh mission in Arkansas, wrote a final letter that simply read, "I have paid what I owed." The 12 children born from the scandal disappeared into the fabric of America like seeds scattered in wind. Some were raised in affluent Creole homes, their pale eyes prompting whispered questions from future generations. Others grew up in free black families in New Orleans, their origins disguised beneath carefully crafted stories of distant relatives. One boy became a respected carpenter during Reconstruction, only to watch his rights crushed under the rise of Jim Crow. Another child drifted west, fought in the Civil War, and vanished into the raw expanse of early America, leaving behind only faint records and rumors. 3 children died before reaching adulthood, their tombstones carved with comforting lies believed fully by the families who buried them. Through all of this scattering, fragments of truth clung stubbornly to the world. Baptismal dates that didn't match birth records, adoption donations listed under false names, family stories that never aligned with parish archives. As for Matthias, the man the church tried to erase, the documents from Cincinnati suggest he lived quietly and honorably, married, worked as a carpenter, raised children of his own, and sat in the pews of a Catholic parish that never knew the storm he survived. Meanwhile, the land where sacred mercy once stood was slowly reclaimed by the swamp. The chapel stones sank into mud, the cemetery fence rusted, and only the whispering cypress trees remembered that a community of women had ever prayed and suffered there. In time, even families in St. Martinville forgot the exact location, pointing vaguely north when asked, while descendants scattered across Louisiana, Texas, Ohio, and beyond lived ordinary lives, unaware that their cheekbones or their light eyes tied them to a scandal buried deliberately beneath the weight of silence. As decades slipped by, The land that once held the convent of the Sacred Mercy vanished beneath layers of moss, mud, and time. Seasonal floods swallowed the remaining stones, and cypress roots tangled through the earth where the sisters had once walked in quiet procession. By the late 19th century, only the rusting cemetery fence remained, leaning, half buried, its iron loops pointing toward the sky like the last fragile testimony of what had happened there. Families in nearby St. Martinville gradually forgot the exact location, recalling only vague stories told by grandparents who spoke carefully, as though afraid the swamp itself might overhear. Meanwhile, descendants scattered across Louisiana, Texas, Ohio, and beyond lived ordinary lives, never imagining that the flicker in their eye color, the sharp angle of a cheekbone, or the stories missing from their family histories tied them to a scandal the church had scrubbed from existence. The silence held because institutions had perfected the art of burying what threatened them. Yet truth rarely dies. It hides in small corners, misfiled documents, baptismal records with inconsistent dates, adoption ledgers written in unfamiliar handwriting. It lingers in family rumors that never match parish accounts. It hides in the stubborn memory of a place long surrendered to the swamp. And though Sacred Mercy's walls disappeared, the story refused to dissolve. In time, quiet fragments surfaced, an unsigned letter in an archive box, a ledger noting payments that could not be explained, a faded entry hinting at births that had no mothers listed. Each fragment was small enough to ignore, but together they formed a shadow, a shape that hinted at something larger beneath the surface. For more than a century, the church maintained silence, trusting that absence of documentation meant absence of truth. But history has its own memory, one that does not always obey authority. And now, as we reach the end of this long descent through secrecy and swamp, a question rises that only you can answer. Could this have happened? Could a scandal like this, layered with guilt, fear, power, and the unquestioned dominance of institutions, have existed in the spaces where records fade and voices were never meant to survive? If this story unsettled you, if it forced you to reconsider how history is shaped and whose voices vanish first, let the forgotten ground of Sacred Mercy remind you that silence is not the same as truth. Here on Chronicles of the Unusual, we seek the stories buried beneath ash and mud. We listen for echoes others refuse to hear, and we refuse to look away from the darkness that shaped the world we inherited. Before you leave, tap like, subscribe, and share this with someone who understands that the past is never just the past. It lives in us, in our families, in our bloodlines, and in the secrets that refuse to stay buried.